In this video, we're going to talk about the steppe peoples of Mongolia and Central Asia and provide background for the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world. It dominated the Eurasian supercontinent. It was militarily the greatest superpower of the 12th and 13th centuries. And we're going to discuss the cultural background in which this massive empire, created by a relatively small number of people, existed. The Mongol Empire was the product of the Mongol tribe and a coalition of other tribes built by the Mongol tribe that was able to militarily overwhelm the much more numerous, much wealthier, more established empires of Sung China, of the Khwarezm Empire in Persia. And the reason for this is that the culture, the lifestyle of Mongol warriors and those of the other nomadic tribes who were part of the Mongols' coalition resulted in them being superior soldiers. The Mongols and their allies were the greatest cavalry soldiers in the history of the world. There has been no other culture more deeply embedded in horseback riding, raising horses, and surviving due to the mastery of horses. So these were outstanding cavalry soldiers who could move very quickly, mass in a specific location, strike very quickly, and then dissipate just as quickly. And it was very difficult for the primarily infantry armies of China, of Persia, to stand up to these powerful horsemen. So we're going to talk about the conditions that led to the rise of this massive empire. The Mongols were outstanding soldiers, as I mentioned earlier. They would surround an enemy army, pelt them with arrows, and when the enemy formation was weakening, they would launch a massive cavalry charge and break the enemy's resolve. Once the enemy's formation, infantry formation, was broken, they would be cut down and slaughtered. These soldiers were the equivalent of Navy SEALs of the time, right? They were the best warriors on earth. So why were they such capable cavalrymen? Well, it had to do with how they survived. The Mongols were pastoralists. They did not farm. They followed herds of livestock, mostly sheep, goats, horses, from watering hole to watering hole, tending to them and protecting them from predators. Because water and grass are in short supply in the more arid parts of the steppe, this led to massive competition between communities. The end result is that on this massive, flat, featureless terrain, you have constant cavalry warfare between clan groups. So the Mongols waged constant small-scale wars against one another for each other's animals, for each other's watering holes. Also, that's how marriage worked. When you wanted a wife in one of these nomadic communities, you had to kidnap one from a neighboring community. That's called an exogamous marriage, where you can only marry outside your ethnic group. The very act of protecting sheep from predators also resulted in these Mongols being great archers, being great horsemen, and otherwise being able to cooperate and strategize at a high level. In fact, even today, the Mongols deeply value games of tactics and strategy. Chess is very, very popular. The Mongols are renowned for, even the people who still engage in nomadic herding, for being masters of chess. These are very, very intelligent people. They have some of the highest IQs in the world. And it's been speculated that now that they have, that with the internet and they have mobile schools that will educate nomadic children, that the Mongols will be the next wave of great engineers and scientists globally. One more aspect of these nomadic cultures, I should point out, is that moving from place to place, fighting each other constantly over limited resources, and survival being very difficult, resulted in a series of cultures where acts of great cruelty were part of everyday life. The end result is that when these armies rampage across the earth, they end up causing massive depopulation of settled areas. When we begin to talk about Genghis Khan and his rampage across Eurasia, I want you to take into account uh, the to remember some of the sheer brutality that we're going to talk about. Genghis Khan depopulated entire portions of the Eurasian supercontinent. And part of this is due to the fact that the Mongols simply didn't have placed the same value on human life that people in uh, more settled, more sedentary societies did. And this is simply a fact. It's one of the most destructive enterprises in the history of the world in terms of its establishment. Once it was established, there was a great period of peace and prosperity. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about the distinct groups. Now, all of these groups they lived very similar lifestyles to one another. Their cultures were very similar, based around horse nomadism, the same thing we talked about, following herds of livestock and fighting incessant warfare against one another on the steppe, the great grassland that stretched from western China all the way to Hungary. The first group we're going to talk about were the Turkic tribes. You'll see them referred to as Turks, or sometimes even by their particular delineation as Turks, like Gok Turks. Anlu Shan, the general who caused the Anlu Shan rebellion that ravaged the Dong dynasty, he was of Turkish origin. The Turks were the first great nomadic people from the steppe to serve as mercenaries in much of the settled world, in China, in Persia, even further west. And in many of these places, the Turks would overthrow the local governments and become military elites. That's how the Ottoman Turks and the Ottoman Empire was founded. The Ottomans were Turks, just like these Turks from Central Asia. They migrated west. They end up settling in Asia Minor and establishing their rule, and they eventually built one of the largest and longest lasting empires in the history of the world. But that's not part of Monsoon Asia. It's outside the scope of this course, other than to just point out that the reach of the Turkic tribes was very far. You have Turkey, the areas in Europe that were conquered by the Turks. You have Turkmenistan in Central Asia, and you also have what we call Turkestan, right, even further to the east in Central Asia. Much of Central Asia is dominated by Turkic peoples. The Uzbeks in Uzbekistan speak a Turkish language, and they're Eastern Turks. And all of the Turks originally were from East Central Asia. They were East Asian in their physical appearance. They were horse nomads. And as they spread out, they conquered new areas. For example, Asia Minor, which we now call Turkey. They would blend with the conquered peoples and establish themselves as a ruling elite. The same thing happened in Hungary. The Magyars, who conquered and established the Kingdom of Hungary, the reason it's called Hungary is they were called Huns. They were called Huns because they were East Asian in appearance. They came from the steppe. They migrated west and invaded Eastern Europe, and they defeated many great powers. They had built a massive empire. They were only checked at the Battle of Lechfeld in the 10th century by the Holy Roman Empire. Once they were defeated, part of the peace agreement was that they would inhabit the plain between the Carpathian Mountains, and they would convert to Christianity. And their first king, Saint Stephen, became a Christian, and the Kingdom of Hungary was established from there. Right? But Hungarians today, obviously, they're European in appearance, but the elite who established the kingdom were originally East Asians. In fact, you can see that influence in how they name themselves. Hungarian is the only language in Europe where the surname comes before the given name, right, in the East Asian model. That's kind of interesting. When I say that these people were East Asian in appearance, I mean predominantly. These people are living in Central Asia. You will find traces of European facial features, hair color, eye color in these populations. In fact, the Mongols referred to the Turks and to the Uyghurs as colored eye people, which, due to the fact that they were further west geographically, and many of them had mixed with Greek populations, with Scythian populations that existed much further to the west, Persian populations that were Indo-European in origin. But nonetheless, that's just a tidbit of trivia, not really relevant. The Uyghurs were the most prominent Turkic people before the rise of the Mongol Empire. And they were prominent because they developed their own alphabet. They had a written language. They built a number of cities in Central Asia where cities were thought where the Chinese thought that developed cities would be impossible to exist. And they were master merchants. They went throughout Eurasia all the way to Western Europe, trading, buying and selling goods, making huge fortunes. And they really helped fuel the economy of the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan and the later Mongols admired the Uyghurs because they were nomads like themselves. They lived pastoral lives, but they were intellectually very, very capable. And as I stated earlier, just because people are living what we might consider primitive lives in terms of their moving in as nomads, that doesn't have anything to do with their intellectual capabilities. These people were very, very, very crafty, very capable at outsmarting anyone in war. The Chinese refer to them as barbarians, as did the Persians, but that's a value judgment based on sedentary agricultural societies. These people were in no way intellectually incapable. And the Uyghurs proved that, right? They were heavily influenced by Buddhism, Manichaeism, which was a heresy of Christianity, and also Nestorian Christianity. But primarily later they would convert to Islam, and the Uyghurs are part of Western China today. They're a very large population in the Xinjiang region in Western China. There's a lot of controversy because the government the current PRC government has kind of cracked down on Uyghur nationalist movements, claiming that they're linked to terrorist movements further to the west, like the Taliban, Al Qaeda, etc. And the Chinese government is very, very harsh on what they call radical Islamic terrorism. So, and that's the term that we use in the West also. So there's common ground between China and some Western governments in terms of during the war on terror, and the Chinese government took full advantage of the global climate during the war on terror to really deal some massive blows to Uyghur political movements. And some have argued that it's ethnic persecution, that there's actually a slow, ongoing genocide of Uyghurs in Western China. But we're on the last lecture, I'm going to talk about these kinds of things. I'm just setting the stage now by talking about the Uyghurs, intellectually, artistically, very capable people who dominated their region of Central Asia, the Xinjiang region, and would later convert to Islam. The Oirats were very similar to the Mongols, the last group we're going to talk about, and the dominant group. The Oirats believed in a religion called Tingriism, which was the indigenous region of virtually all Altaic peoples. Altaic is a language family like Indo-European, Sino-Tibetan, right? It's this broad language family of peoples who are almost all of them nomadic, living in Central Asia. So it's all the people we're talking about today speak an Altaic language, right? So they have a common ancestry going way back. The Oirats were one of them. They believed in Tingriism, based on the god Tingri, the god of the blue sky. And in Tingriism, you have this supreme god who is the god of the blue sky, and they believed that they have a number of origin myths involving wolves, that people came from wolves. And of course, you can see why they would want to say they came from wolves, because wolves are great hunters. And not only that, they work together to hunt, which is something that you had to do on the steppe. You have to work together. If you don't work together, you're going to die. You're going to die of starvation, dehydration, the elements, or you're going to be killed by another group. This land is both hot and cold. It can be hot in the daytime in the summer, and it can be frigid below freezing at night. You can very easily freeze to death in Mongolia. It borders Siberia. Many deserts of the world are frigid at night, hot in the daytime. And of course, on the western end, you have the Gobi Desert. On the eastern end, you have the Mongolic Plain, which is the land everybody wants, where you can graze your horses, graze your cows, or your goats and sheep, and sometimes cows. They did have cattle, and they prized cattle, particularly the milk and the meat of cows. But cows were very difficult to raise relative to sheep and goats. So only the really prosperous and powerful tribesmen, clans, held cows. And the Oirats, like many of the other peoples we've talked about, the Turks and the Uyghurs, with the exception of the Uyghurs, they lived in semi-permanent settlements. They would build houses as they moved. The Oirats lived in yurts, which are really complex tents, really intricate tents. In fact, I'm going to include a video about a Mongolian school. You can see the yurt that the family lives in. It's very complex. These are the person who built it is a master craftsman. Now let's talk a bit about the Merkits. The Merkits were another nomadic tribe related to the Oirats, the Mongols, the Naiman, all of the ones we've mentioned. And they followed around their herds. They lived in yurts. When they wanted a wife, they had to go kidnap one from a neighboring clan or tribe. You couldn't have an endogamous marriage. You couldn't marry a woman from your own community. That was taboo. It led to inbreeding. So to find a bride, you had to go form a war party, and you had to go out and steal one. In fact, this is how Genghis Khan's wife, Borta, was taken, and he ended up taking her back in the same way. When we talk about Genghis Khan's life, we'll go into detail about that. So that's romance on the steppe, kidnapping, and then you spending the rest of your life with the husband who kidnapped you, unless your relatives can come and take you back. Now, nonetheless, I don't want to give the wrong impression. Relative to China, relative to some other societies, Mongol women had much more personal freedom and much more say in day-to-day affairs than women in many other cultures. Nonetheless, the marital arrangement was the result of kidnapping most of the time. You did have arranged marriages. Genghis Khan's marriage was originally an arranged marriage until she was kidnapped, and then he had to go and take her back. But the Merkits lived this way. They lived in yurts. They followed livestock, just as the Oirats, just as the Mongols and other groups. Another steppe tribe were the Carrots. The Carrots were interesting because they were related to the Mongols, the Oirats, the Merkits, and more loosely to the Turkic tribes, the Uyghurs, etc. And they were horse nomads. They lived a similar lifestyle, but their religious beliefs were different. They didn't follow the traditional religion of Tingriism that most steppe peoples followed. They didn't worship the god of the blue sky. They didn't believe that they originated from a wolf and a doe coming together in union and creating the first of their kind. They were Nestorian Christians. And Nestorian Christianity is an eastern branch of Christianity that spread all the way from Syria into Persia, all the way through Central Asia, all the way to China. Nestorian Christianity differs from Catholic or Orthodox Christianity in that at the Council of Ephesus, the priest Nestor was condemned for arguing that Christ has one nature that is both fully human and fully divine. The Orthodox and Catholic view at the time, this is before the split between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, the belief was that Christ had two natures, one fully human, one fully divine. So Nestor wasn't really saying anything different in essence. What was really going on was linguistic confusion. And that's true of many of the Christological controversies of the first half of the first millennium of Christian history. We're not going to go into that, though. Needless to say, this was a form of Christianity that was very similar to Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism. In fact, both sides don't regard Nestorian Christianity as a heresy in 2026. But it was very widely practiced in Central Asia. And the Carrots practiced this. So while they were following around their herds of sheep and goat and horses and fighting in raids and going and kidnapping women to marry them from neighboring communities, they were also having mass in their yurts, right, in churches that were mobile that they moved around with them. So they had a great influence, in fact, and so much so that emissaries from Western Europe were ultimately sent with the idea of reaching the Carrots and forming an alliance with them against the Muslims of the Middle East, right? The great Islamic powers. This never really went anywhere, but the Carrots were very influential on the steppe. The next to last group we're going to talk about were the Naiman. The Naiman lived in southwestern Mongolia, and like the Carrots, they were Nestorian Christians. So they had a similar religious persuasion, and it doesn't seem like it would be the case, but many of the horsemen on the steppe in the 12th century were Christian. The Naiman were very economically and politically advanced relative to many of the other tribes. They had a fixed hierarchy. You didn't become a chieftain because you were the greatest war leader. You inherited your position. They had nobility more similar to that in China or in Persia or in Europe or the other settled sedentary lands. You didn't have the kind of extreme, chaotic meritocracy that many of the steppe peoples engaged in which you continually had to prove yourself as a war leader, prove your bravery, prove your skill at arms, prove your skill as a tactician, and lead people to prosperity, or people would abandon you and choose a new ruler. The Mongols, I use that in the loosest way, all these different communities could choose their own leadership according to their traditional norms, except for the Naiman. The Naiman had fixed relationships based on birth. On top of this, they were more heavily involved in commerce than the other tribes of what's now Mongolia. They engaged with frequent trade with the Uyghurs. They engaged in trade with Chinese merchants, and they were very wealthy as a result compared to the other steppe peoples. I'd like to focus at the end of this presentation on the Mongols themselves. Now, we're talking specifically about the Mongol tribe. Later on, Mongols would mean all of these people, right? But in this period of time, Mongols are one specific tribe out of the overall steppe ethnic group that would later become known as the Mongols. The Mongols were just like the Oirats, the Merkits, the Carrots, and the Naiman, in that they lived through herding. They lived in yurts. You can see images of the yurts there. They were master horsemen, master archers. But the Mongols were different from the other clans in that they took this idea of meritocracy to the extreme. Your status, your birth meant next to nothing in this community. If you were going to lead men in war, You had to be fit, you had to be strong, you had to be the best warrior out of the bunch. This is the community that Genghis Khan rose up in. And in fact, this is the community that almost destroyed him. When his father was poisoned, as we'll learn about in our video on Genghis Khan, his people abandoned him. They didn't care that he was the son of their previous chief and was set to inherit. They said, this little kid can't lead us anywhere. So they left him. They took all the animals with them. He was barely surviving with his brothers and mother out in the steppe. And so his childhood was spent in absolute hardship, fighting to survive, fighting for food, fighting his own people as well as those of other tribes who were trying to attack him. And as a result, Genghis Khan grew up absolutely ruthless. You can imagine, he was thrown in with the crocodiles at an early age and came out swinging, right? Came out an absolute legend of a man. But he very nearly did not survive on many instances. And this is the culture that the Mongols had created, right? One based on merit, on strength, and not on birth. And Genghis Khan would take that culture, he would apply it to all of the steppe and end up creating a meritocracy that resulted in the most powerful land army the world had seen up to that point in time. And if you look at all the khanates, right, all of that, I want you to take a look at this map here. This is the map of the world after Genghis Khan unified the Mongols. You can see in the blue there in Mongolia, north of northern China, the yellow. When we take a look at all the land that the Mongols came to dominate, China, Central Asia, Persia, Eastern Europe, huge tracts of land, an absolutely massive empire, the largest contiguous land empire that the world has ever seen, and one of the most influential empires in world history, because this empire linked China and the West in a way that had never occurred before. It stimulated trade. It stimulated European interest in the Far East, which would ultimately lead to the voyages of discovery and the discovery of the Americas. This period of time plays a massive role in shaping world history. And it's because Genghis Khan, first of all, survived. Secondly, applied the cultural tenets of his Mongol heritage, meritocracy, strength, cunning, to the establishment of an empire that would come to dominate most of Eurasia.